Hello and welcome to the Saturday morning NeuroSim update for September 27th. I have a couple things to update us on today. The first thing is, of course, we had our DevoWare meeting this week. So, number 32, and that's on the DevoWare YouTube channel. And we covered two topics this week. The first one was to go over a paper that utilized the CompuCell 3D modeling software. And in meeting 31, we did a paper that covered ComSol, which is a multi-physics modeling tool. And in 32, we covered CompuCell 3D as a comparison to see how those things were implemented. We also then dealt with kind of an overview of the VectorCosm artificial life platform, which is kind of an interesting platform. It was brought to my attention by Hussein. He put it in one of the Slack channels, and I went over some of the materials there. It has a GitHub repository, and they're doing some interesting things with life cycle and with behavior. So it's something to check out. So I'd like to go over a few more items. So this is follow-up from last week's meeting. Jesse initiated a conversation on this event here. And so we talked about Michael Levin and Josh Bongard's work on embodied robotics and a lot of the things they were doing at this Foresight virtual seminar group. And so this was held on the 19th, so this was last Friday. And the title was Embodied Natural Intelligence versus Embodied Artificial Intelligence. So a few words on this. First of all, thank you, Jesse, for presenting. But the other thing is that it's interesting to see how they're kind of approaching some of this work. So, of course, there's this interest in taking what we know about natural intelligence and embodiment and replicating it as embodied artificial intelligence. So this is sort of the description here. And so, let's see, the abstract reads, the author Jacob Bronowski famously expressed, the hand is the cutting edge of the mind, meaning things are translated into movements into the body from the mind. So it's not just in the brain as activity in the world is a major component. Natural systems, including humans, advanced mammals, and even avian species, have a core ability of treating tools as extensions of the body, a trait highlighting an evolutionary advantage of generalizing motor skills. Natural systems can even operate devices that have no ethological precedent. So they give the example of a monkey driving a car, indicating a general purpose learning machinery for embodied control. So these bold terms are things that they kind of are stressing in the discussion. Yet in the internet scale age of data, modern robotics remains surprisingly brittle in comparison to the above. So, this general purpose learning machinery, the ability to generalize motor skills, treat tools as extensions of the body, coordinating tools with movements, and then having this aspect of ethological precedent or no sort of ethological precedent. And all those things we haven't been able to master. In this talk, we ask what exactly embodied intelligence is and unpack the reasons behind the persistently large gap in capability and reliability between natural and artificial systems in the realm of physical interaction. So Josh Bongard in particular is always involved in the embodied intelligence workshops. So he has some really interesting work on morphological computing and robotics. And of course, Morgan's been working with the platform that Josh Bongard has open sourced for his class. And, I was thinking about this after. So I was thinking about that after last week's meeting and wondering how, you can approach sort of these embodied robotic builds as this sort of evolved parts list. We've been doing some things with parts lists in a few publications. Also, thinking about this in contrast to some of the phylogenetic methods that we proposed. So I'm interested to see what kind of arises from that work, since the Bongard lab has this computational sort of toolbox that we might be able to use. The second thing I wanted to bring up is this package called PyReason. This is something that was also put in the Slack, I think, by Morgan. And this is a Python package where they're doing neurosymbolic computing. So PyReason is a powerful Python-based temporal first-order logic explainable AI system supporting multi-step inference, uncertainty, open-world reasoning, and graph-based syntax. And so this is the package here. So you can download the paper, which is on arXiv. You can look at the introductory blog post, or you can download the PyP project, or just load it in a Python environment. So this is nice stuff. I actually have some slides here as well and some videos. And this is basically what they're doing. So they have this graph, which has an initial state. They have rules, which are either learned or manually specified. And then you have this these outputs, which are the explainable evolution of the graph over time. So this graph changes according to the rules, according to interactions. And then you can explain the outputs. So a lot of times, if I run a network and I let it run for a long time and then I plot a graph, there's no way for me to interpret that graph. So this is an explainable system. And then you can compute things like rewards or other aggregates, which is nice because you have this neurosymbolic tool that's also auditable. And so this is all looks like a very interesting package. And they have some papers using PyReason. So this is out of the Neurosymbolic AI lab at Arizona State. So they've used this in a number of papers. This one is a geospatial trajectory generation via efficient abduction, deployment for independent testing. Of course, abduction being a type of inference. We have the preprint and this talk at ICLP. And the next one is scalable semantic non-Markovian simulation proxy for reinforcement learning. The next one is PyReason as a sim for deep reinforcement learning. And they have 3 papers. That's pretty good. Yeah, this looks interesting. We should dig into this and talk about this a little bit more. All right, so now I want to talk about the Active Inference Institute and the symposium that's coming up. So we have the symposium in November, and I'm working on a couple of talks for this. I'm working on a talk on spatial intelligence and spatial cognition, which kind of came out of the work that we're submitting to the special issue that Adam Saffron is hosting in Philosophical Transactions A. So that paper is coming along, but as part of that, we talk a little bit about spatial cognition and some of the computational models one might use. And so this is kind of where this talk is going. So I'll post the talk on YouTube closer to the symposium date. I'm also working on a talk on open source, our open source sustainability project. So we have a number of different projects that we've done over the past few summers, and we have of course our focus on reinforcement learning, but also our focus on active inference, and I kind of give an overview of those different efforts, and then frame that in the larger context of open source sustainability and how that project might move forward. So stay tuned for those talks. They'll be on our YouTube channel in due time. But this is the Active Inference website. So the Active Inference website, I haven't really gone over this too much. Usually I'm interacting with the Institute on the back end, and we don't spend enough time kind of going over their website. So they have a lot of educational opportunities at the Active Inference Institute. They have the textbook group where they're working on this Active Inference textbook. They're just kind of working on chapter by chapter. It's a participatory effort, and the whole lab, of course, is participatory, but the textbook group is participatory. They have courses, they have live streams, of course, in the symposium. This is the symposium. So live streams they're always very useful. I've participated in one or two of them, and they have them almost every other week. So you should be able to get some, keep keep tabs with some of the things that they're doing. I'm really impressed by the breadth of live stream coverage that they have. Then, of course, research. You have the research overview, but you have a number of software packages such as arXiv, active block fronts, the theoretical neuroscience group, which is, of course, run by Carl Friston, and then knowledge engineering. And then, of course, they have the participation link and some other things. They're running these sort of research fellowships or research internships where people who are interested in doing work on active inference can get supported by the Institute. They also have a number of different partnerships with different organizations. And we're of course supporting the Active Inference Institute in their endeavors. Let's talk a little bit about the symposium. This is the website for the symposium. So this goes back to 2021, where they did a symposium, which was basically Carl Friston giving a set of lectures. So that was the first one, and then the second one was in 2022. That was on robotics. The third one was in 2023. That was enacting ecosystems of shared intelligence. And these are all kind of on, I think they're on YouTube. I'm not really sure what the state of these first three are. I remember catching some videos for the third annual symposium. But the fourth annual symposium was the one from last year, and this had a lot of deep coverage on YouTube, and of course we contributed to this. We contributed three things to this, actually four. Jesse gave a talk. I gave two talks on behalf of the lab, one for open source and open access, and then the other one on our Cybernetics research group. And then we had an interview with Stefan Bollman, who is doing a lot of things with software reusability and computational neuroscience and analysis of neuroscience data. So yeah, it was a nice talk that we went over. And then in the fifth annual symposium is coming up November 12th through 14th. So the registration is now open. So if you're interested, register to attend or watch on YouTube live stream. And it should be a great time. I also wanted to highlight something Jesse is doing with GeoPro. So this is something that was listed on LinkedIn. I don't like to actually pull up LinkedIn during the meeting because they have a lot of visual accoutrement that I'll charitably call it visual accoutrement that accompany the site. So we'll just do it like this. So this is Jesse posting this about this topic in GeoPro. So of course he's trying to develop this GeoPro Future Center, and so he's in this post he's covering this pessimism optimism split. And so what that's referring to is some demographic data about Gen Z. So the data reveal that Gen Z feels significantly higher levels of pessimism about the current state of things, including their jobs, their financial system, and the country, which is the United States. In this survey, 71% expressed negative views about the country's state, compared to 59% of older employees. This pessimistic outlook begins with personal circumstances. Gen Z reports much higher dissatisfaction regarding financial situations and work situations. But then if you look at sort of the future, or looking towards the future, Gen Z demonstrates consistently lower levels of pessimism about what's coming next than their older colleagues. While they may be harsh critics of current conditions, younger workers are genuinely optimistic about what lies ahead. And so these are the data in bar chart form. And so Gen Z's optimism about future work situations, 20% more optimistic than older employees, suggests they believe workplace conditions can improve through effort and change. Their financial optimism, 22% more optimistic, indicates confidence in their ability to build economic security over time. Even about the state of the country, largely outside individual control, Gen Z shows greater future optimism. This suggests a fundamental belief in positive change possibilities and ultimately greater change readiness and agility in the workplace. And so this is one of the things that Jesse's trying to work out with um, his Joe Pro Futures idea. So yeah, I think he's got some interesting things to say about that. Yeah, so that's great. Thank you. Congratulations, Jesse. That's good. So a few things that are out now from the lab at ResearchGate. This first one is phylogenetic models of embodied agents, an eco-evo-devo approach. This is a preprint that's kind of freshly released on ResearchGate. And what we like to do is release things on ResearchGate and get some interactions with it to see how people respond, and then maybe put some things on arXiv later or publish them somewhere else. And so this is the first item I'm going to talk about here. This is phylogenetic models of embodied agents. This was presented at the Embodied Intelligence Workshop this year. So usually we submit a paper in conjunction with that talk, and this is the paper for this year. This is just I'm the sole author on this, and it kind of walks through embodied agents and how you can analyze embodied agents using phylogenetics, how you can build phylogenetic agents from a parts list, but a parts list that has a phylogenetic sort of set of relationships. So that means that you're going to have parts that have a common origin and that are elaborated on through evolutionary processes or just simply through classification. And so, we in one of the figures in the paper involves an analysis of Bradenburg vehicles using the phylogenetic approach. And so but this frames us in the eco-evo-devo approach. So we bring in things from developmental Bradenburg vehicles. We also bring things in from embodiment research quite explicitly in this paper. And so this is the other paper. This is from our cybernetics group. So this is the cybernetics group listed as authors. And this is called A Brief History of Cybernetic Imperatives in Behavior. So this paper follows up on the talk that we gave last year at the Active Inference Institute Symposium. So if you recall that talk, that involved going back to Rosenbluth 1943, looking at their behavioral typology and reinterpreting that in a number of different ways. There are also some other gems in here with respect to cybernetic control and behavior, and thinking about behavior in terms of cybernetic imperatives, which are sort of reinterpreting the idea of goal-directedness as purposeful and looking at the roots of behavior, building up compositionally to more complex behaviors. So actually, if we go back to the paper on phylogenetics, this is the figure 1, which is actually it's a 3-part figure, which goes over this phylogenetic analysis of Bradenburg vehicles. So you can see kind of they're very faint, uh, but these are the Bradenburg vehicles that are proposed in Bradenburg's 1984 book, Vehicles. So he proposes 3 classes of vehicles, 1, 2, and 3. For vehicle 1, it's very simple. It's 1A, which is a single wheel on a single axis, kind of a unicycle with a sensor at the front. And so this is, of course, it produces forward Brownian motion, and this is kind of the simplest vehicle you can have. Then there's class 2, which elaborates on different connections between sensor and effector, both ipsilateral and contralateral. So you have these, analogies from the nervous system, and they produce all sorts of interesting behaviors that Bradenburg characterizes both as sort of functional and affective, which is, kind of maybe a leap on his part, but that's kind of the way he did that. And then so we have 2A, 2B, and 2C. And then we have our class 3, which is A, B, and C. And these are vehicles that have multiple connections between sensor and effector and exhibit more complex behaviors, both affective and functional. So this is kind of doing a phylogenetic analysis of the information that Bradenburg gave about vehicles. So it involved a lot of hard coding of different character states. And so these are the different phylogenetic arrangements that were sort of the output of this analysis. So 1A is typically considered in phylogenetic analysis to be an outgroup, and then 2 and 3 are their own clades, of course. And this is kind of a little bit different from a typical phylogenetic analysis in that we kind of know what the classification should be. So 2 and 3 are going to group together, but we don't know the internal structure in 2 and 3. So we look at 2 and 3. We have 2B forming this sort of, 2A, 2B, and 2, 3 form a clade. 2A and 2C form a clade within that clade, and they both exhibit this sort of crosstalk with cowardice behavior. So the crosstalk is the cross connections between sensor and effector. And then 2B is this sort of lone taxon in this clade where it has crosstalk but aggression instead of cowardice. And then 3A, 3B, and 3C, we have 3A and 3B. So the second clade is 3A, 3B, and 3C. We have 3A and 3B as this internal clade where you have actually 2 different behaviors but the same architecture or very similar architectures, love and exploration. And then we have this other architecture which is multiple connections from a group of sensors to a group of effectors or to one effector, and then that exhibits different types. So there's crosstalk in this one, multiple forms of crosstalk, and this gives us a behavior called values. The common ancestry between 2 and 3 is this goal-directed motion as opposed to Brownian motion. And so this is just the other parts of this figure just showing the examples of, say, shared derived traits or homology. So we have homology here, which is this vehicle state. We have goal-directed motion, which is up here. And we have independently derived traits or convergent evolution of crosstalk. So you see crosstalk in both 2 and 3, and you can say that those are convergently evolved. So why do this analysis? Well, it's interesting because, of course, we can classify vehicles in a different way. Typically the classification is sort of top-down, but we can also understand how some of these traits might evolve if we want to, say, create a substrate for the evolution of vehicles. We see that, there's certain things that might independently evolve, and some things that can be sort of shared derived traits. So we'll know what, say, to hard code into basic vehicle, say, genotypic representation if we're using a genetic algorithm, or if we want to build something that has, the ability to evolve behaviors through interactions with its environment and selection, then we should expect certain traits, certain phenotypes, certain types of embodiment to occur again and again. So that's basically the value of this analysis. And then this is figure 2 talks about the sort of parts list approach. So this is where we look at phylogeny of, this isn't Bradenburg's vehicles, but these are vehicles that from a parts list that we define, and the parts list is kind of reconfigured basically through evolution, and we can see that you can have these phylogenies where you have common ancestor and you have variations on these, or elaborations on these different phenotypes. So this is of use of thinking about what kinds of vehicles can you get from a common ancestor, meaning certain assemblage of parts, and then what are the sort of the alternative forms that we might expect. So this is the brief history of cybernetics and imperatives and behavior paper. A couple points about this paper. First of all, this is our the current state of our sort of timeline of teleology. And so this paper focuses on teleology and cybernetics. So this actually goes back to ancient times and the medieval times and how they kind of thought about progress in nature and teleology, and then how that kind of became a naturalistic phenomenon, and then how that was, or changed or was otherwise incorporated into different theories or more modern theories. So, this influenced thinking about evolution by natural selection, but it also influenced thinking about vitalism. It actually has some influence on things like Bayesian modeling and a priori knowledge. And it even has connections to things like behavior as habit, and other types of things. So there are three kind of streams here, one leading directly from ancient times, B leading from sort of the work of the first behaviorists and psychologists, and then this sort of Bayesian path, which leads to goal-directed behavior and some variations on that. So it's kind of a nice timeline. It kind of goes through a lot of different, um, different milestones and different pieces of work that kind of lay out some of this intellectual terrain. Then, of course, we have the behavioral classifications, behavioral typologies that come from Rosenbluth 1943. So this is a reproduction of that behavioral typology. And so as we recall, we decompose behavior into things like active behavior, purposeful behavior, teleological behaviors like feedback, extrapolative behaviors like prediction, and then orders of prediction. And then everything else in each stage of this is sort of a non-category or a non-class. So like, for example, you have active behavior, and then you have passive behavior, but passive behavior includes all non-active behaviors. So anything that's non-active is in this category. The same for purposeful. If it's purposeful, it's in this sort of line of leading up to order of prediction. And if it's non-purposeful, it's just this non-category of random behaviors. And so the terminology, of course, is taken from Rosenbluth, so maybe the terminology is suboptimal, but that's the way that they envision this. And so one of the things about this behavioral typology that's nice is that we can play around with it. We can move things around. We can add in different components. And so one of the ways in which this was done one of the ways in which this is done is to show some of these, to play around with some of these non-classes and to say that they have different variants in them. So this one is a variation where the non-purposeful non-category is replaced by a historical sort of alternative to purposeful. And so this is just one example of how this can be done. Figure 4 shows a little bit more ambitious change where we have, instead of purposeful as the path to the order of prediction, we have non-purposeful or random behaviors leading to the order of complexity. And so, we're kind of playing around with these categories. This next one involves looking, instead of the order of complexity, the order of dynamics. So this is where we have active behaviors, non-purposeful or random behaviors, nonlinear or non-teleological behaviors, dynamical behaviors or recurrence, and then the order of dynamics, which can be first, second, or third, or higher. And so this is, kind of a useful tool for looking at some of these, how behavior can be decomposed, and then, of course, composed if we go in the opposite direction. So if we want to, say, understand behaviors from, say, like a general order of complexity or a general order of dynamics, say we want to build a robotic system where we know what kind of dynamics we want, we just want to build or compose a system of behaviors that meets that requirement, then we can use this typology to sort of build, like, kind of backwards along this typology from the order of complexity or dynamics back to like dynamics or non-prediction, feedback or nonlinear, non-purposeful, active. So we know kind of what components need to be there and how we need to add them together. Another kind of valuable thing in this paper is this table of cybernetic imperatives. So this is where we have these imperatives kind of listed here, these processes that are associated with these imperatives, and then the example of the behavior. So some of these are like animal behaviors, some of these are behaviors of like that we see in humans, some of these are physical behaviors like soap foam dynamics or Brownian motion. Some of these are complex processes like avalanches, and so they're more collective behaviors like bird flocking. So there are a lot of different types of imperatives listed, different processes that drive them, and then different examples. And then this is an example of sort of this progression in behavioral sort of integrity or behavioral, going from Brownian motion to higher order prediction and dynamics. So this was hand drawn because they didn't really have a way to plot this out properly in using a program. But in any case, this proceeds from Brownian motion, which is like this random motion around a point, to these sort of levy flights where you get this random motion around a point, but you have these jumps, these exploratory jumps. Then you have ballistic movements, which are straight line movements in a certain direction that then get corrected later down the line through feedback, and you get this sort of trajectory that keeps missing the mark and having to be corrected later. So you get this sort of ballistic sort of trajectory where it's very little instantaneous control. It's more like delayed control. In 4, we have first order prediction and dynamics, where we have smooth smoother dynamics, smoother prediction, but it's still, reliant on sort of this discontinuous feedback. And then finally, number 5 is higher order prediction and dynamics with the smooth curve, which is the product of continual feedback and control. So this is a first draft of this paper. I think it's probably, I don't know what we're going to do with it. I just wanted to get it out before the symposium so that we have something to kind of advertise and then build on for later. Okay, why don't we do a paper before we conclude for today. So this paper is called Control Across Scales, Signals, Information, and Adaptive Biological Mechanical Function. So this is from the arXiv, and it's from the Nonlinear Dynamics group at the Department of Physics at UT Austin. So they're interested in sort of a physics approach to control and thinking about many different types of systems, much as we have been talking about in the cybernetic imperatives paper. So the abstract reads, biological systems perform an astonishing array of dynamical processes, including development and repair, regulation, behavior, and motor control. So there's this wide variety of behaviors that are kind of incorporated into this. Sensing and signaling and adaptation, among others. So a whole range of behaviors across different types of systems. Powered by the transduction of stored energy resources, these behaviors enable biological systems to regulate functions, achieve specific outcomes, and maintain stability far from thermodynamic equilibrium. These behaviors span orders of magnitude in length and in time. So from nanometer scale molecular motors driving morphogenesis to kilometer scale seasonal migrations, and from millisecond reflexes to millennia of evolutionary adaptations. While physical laws govern the dynamics of biological systems, they alone are insufficient to explain how living systems sense, decide, adapt, and ultimately control their dynamics. So this is kind of where we're going with some of these imperatives building upon each other. So in this case, we're talking about this gap between physical laws and how they sort of describe sort of biological systems as dynamical systems, but it doesn't really describe, say, the internal state or the internal components of such a behavior. So behavior is generated in a far different way than we understand how to analyze it. In this article, we argue that control theory provides a powerful unifying framework for understanding how biological systems regulate dynamics to maintain stability across length and time scales far from equilibrium. So this is a physics approach to a similar type of problem that we talk about in the cybernetic imperatives paper. And so their focus is on biological mechanics, although they kind of take inspiration from a large number of systems. So they start off with talking about the kinds of behaviors that physics can compactly describe. So, for example, they talk about different types of behaviors of, say, like throwing a baseball, or the behavior of a commercial airplane as it takes flight, or how bicycles can roll and exhibit behaviors in that way. And so these different types of behaviors are well described by the laws of physics, but there are all sorts of other motion-based behaviors that are maybe less well described by physics. And so they point out here that biological mechanics is ultimately and inherently a non-equilibrium process. At the molecular scale, active chemomechanical processes convert free energy reserves to mechanical work. One major example is, of course, molecular motor behavior, so myosins, kinesins, and thymins. which hydrolyze ATP to generate sliding motion within the cytoskeleton, a network of biological polymers. Now, how do motors at around the 100 nanometer scale drive mechanics on the cellular and organismal scales, which are usually around 10 microns to 1 meter? And so we can turn to condensed matter physics to find those descriptions, but we want to consider these as sort of part of a larger class of behaviors. So on the left, we have these different types of systems that produce motion through animal cells and analogies of animal cells. So we have this control signal, and then we have the system described by GXU. We have the control signal U. So we have some examples here. We have a molecular motor which drives motion in a cell. We have a motor neuron which drives motion in a human soccer player. We have a joystick which drives motion in a robot. And so this control signal U is moving the system forward. Then we have this second class where we have sensory systems and how they drive controllers. So we have the sensory signal Y and the controller KYR. And so here we have this gated ion channel that controls a network of interactions. We have this we have axonal conductance, which controls dynamics in the brain. And then we have this control signal or the sensory signal for an autonomous vehicle, which controls a microchip and a microcontroller. So these are just different instances of the sensory signal being used to control a system. Then the third category, we have fuel, which is delta G, and an actuator, which is W delta G. So we have this fuel, which exhibits a change in these different types of systems. So we have this fuel, which fuels this molecular motion that then contributes to both plant and animal movement. We have this electrical source, which fuels an electrical motor. So we have these different sources of fuel, ATP and electricity, and they fuel these different movements in different systems through actuation. So they actually do some things with feedback and control here. So they have this these different time scales. They have the mechanism time scale, the function time scale, the learning time scale, and the adaptation time scale. And this gives us some additional sort of control systems and cybernetic motifs to work through. So the first one is a mechanism time scale, and that's characterized by feed-forward control. So feed-forward control occurs over the time scales inherent to the physical mechanism, which control systems from the controller K influence the system G. And then feedback control is where you have the controller K influencing the system G, but then the system G influencing the system K through feedback. So this is at the function time scale. So if you think about the mechanism is something that is sort of a driving force. So you might have a chemical reaction where one thing influences another. Feedback is where that thing that's influenced then in turn influences the thing influencing it. So it's kind of like a rate limiting or self-limiting process. And of course, we know the differences in terms of feed-forward and feedback. As in this case, it's building upon the complexity of that behavioral system. Then we have adaptive control. So adaptive control is where we're at the learning time scale. So of course K influences G, and then G in turn influences K. But you have this integrator, which then helps K learn. So it's this purple circle that's an integrator, and it integrates feedback in different ways to give K different granularities of information about the system G. And then adaptation timescale, which is where you have physical adaptation rather than adaptive control. You have, of course, your adaptive control through, um, we have like a gray circle, which is, of course, integrating um, the feedback from G to K, and that's influencing K. But then we have another integrator which actually influences G. So this is G being influenced by the feedback that it's giving to K. So this is the difference between learning and adaptation. Learning is where you have feedback that is sort of supervised, and then adaptation is where that supervised feedback is then influenced by changes in G. So you can adapt to different conditions. Um, and so this is what they kind of consider different larger timescales, like evolutionary timescales or population timescales. And so it's an interesting way to represent these different things because, again, you have like kind of this cybernetic system, although they're thinking about it in terms of a control system, and how those different levels of acquisition of behavior are structured. Okay, so that's all for the updates for this week. Thank you for paying attention, and see you next week.